Hello and welcome to the third of 8 lectures in the series Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This series is produced by Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, in cooperation with Third Age Learning, KW. These lectures were presented at Rim Park in Waterloo between January 9th and February 27th, 2020. This lecture, Everything New is Old Again, Tradition and Innovation in Luther's Theology and Religious Practice, is delivered by Reverend Dr. Alan Jorgenson, Professor of Systematic Theology and Assistant Dean of Martin Luther University College.
Thank you for being here. What a gift it is that you have taken time out of your day to come and be with me today to think a little bit about Luther. And thank you so much for the land acknowledgement. One of my research interests has been learning about the spirituality and religious worldviews of indigenous peoples. And it's so intriguing. The Haudenosaunee, they have a practice, some of you probably know this, of starting their events or their learning times with a Thanksgiving address. They call it the words before all other words. And it crafts in the people as they do this sort of a posture of gratitude. And I think entering into things with a posture of gratitude reframes the way we hear. So thank you for that address. I should tell you a little bit something about myself, since we're going to be spending some time together. I'm a professor of systematic theology, which is a notoriously difficult title to explain, but I'll do my best. So in theology, people who do systematic theology, they're very interested in looking at the Christian tradition, what we've said, taught, believed, confessed, and how it impacts and interacts with contemporary culture, contemporary concerns. So we're having this conversation between history and the current and contemporary context. The other thing that interests systematic theologians is asking the question, now, how do all of these different things we say hold together? So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about justification, Luther's theology of the cross, Luther's notion of vocation, a little bit about word and sacrament if time permits. And so a systematic theologian saying, is Luther consistent as he writes about these things? Do they sort of hold together? And what's the collective piece that we learn as we think about those? The other piece that systematic theologians like to do is to be self-critical about our religious perspectives, always asking the question, this is what I believe, but why do I believe it? Why do we believe it? And what are some voices that might help me to better understand what I believe, and perhaps sometimes even to challenge those? That's an important piece of the puzzle of being a systematic theologian. I'm also a pastor. I was ordained in the Lutheran Church in 1990. My first parish was in Slave Lake, Alberta, northern Alberta, St. Peter's Ecumenical Parish, a most interesting place to have your first bit of work. The church there, many churches in the near north and the far north, and increasingly all across Canada, have smaller denominations. The mainline denominations are a bit smaller, and so we sometimes have congregations work together. And so at St. Peter's Ecumenical Church, there's a Lutheran congregation, an Anglican congregation, and a United Church congregation, and we work together. So, and we worshiped together, and we did projects together, we did everything together. They hired me. The person who was before me was an Anglican priest. And so it's really an interesting, an incredibly rich place to begin your work as a pastor, and it's shaped me as a theologian as well. So one Sunday would be an Anglican service, then a Lutheran service, a United Church service. So it was a marvelous opportunity. I was very pleased for it, and it gave me a strong interest in ecumenical and in multi-faith issues, so those kind of named me. I moved from there to Toronto to work on my PhD, and while in Toronto I served a small church in Aurelia, a mission church, and would go up on weekends and work with the community. And then towards the end of my doctoral program, we moved to Kitchener, and I was the pastor at St. James Lutheran Church in Mannheim, just on the west edge of Kitchener. So my intellectual thought is very much shaped by questions about how does what we say impact how we live? What difference does it make is, for me, pretty important. Beyond that, a couple other things that are important is I love art. You're going to see some art in my slides. It sort of keeps me energized, and I think it's a good way for us to think. I don't know if any of you have ever read Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. Has anybody read that? A few people have. I love how the author describes how when we do art, we are using a different part of our brain, and it kind of enables us to be more holistic in our way of doing things. So I think I use art all the time in my classes as a way to kind of get people using their brain in a more holistic way. I'm a father. My wife, Gwen works for Habitat for Humanity Canada. The office is in Toronto, but she has a home office here in Kitchener, and I'm the father of 3 daughters. 2 are engineers, mechanical engineers, and 1 is a geologist. So we got lots of science in the family, so that makes things interesting. They're adorable. It's a shame you don't have them here instead of me. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Martin Luther. So I've titled this Everything New is Old Again, as a way to sort of get us thinking about, is there anything new under the sun? Is there anything new under the sun? And my answer is yes and no. That's a good Lutheran answer, yes and no. There isn't, in the sense that a lot of the things that Luther deals with are perennial questions for human beings. He shapes them in a way that's particular. His genius is that he takes problems and shapes them in a way that speaks to his context in kind of a new fashion. And I think that's what's quite enduring about him. The Lutheran Church is growing astronomically across the globe, in the global south. Although Lutheran churches, like most churches, are shrinking in North America. I was recently at an event in Ethiopia. The church in Ethiopia, the Lutheran church in Ethiopia called Mekane Yesu, after the Second World War, had something like 60,000 members, and currently it has 10 million members. It's just exploding. So Luther does indeed have a global impact, and so we want to think a little bit about that as well. So you've learned a lot about Luther from Mark and from Bob last week, but a couple of things I want to again highlight is Martin Luther as a communicator. He was a very rich writer. He wrote in 2 languages. If you're going to work with Luther in a serious way, you need to know a bit of German and Latin. His collection of his works, the Weimar Ausgabe, has 127 volumes. Translated into English, there's been about 55, and there's doing some new translations as well. He was a master of languages, a master of Latin and New Testament Greek, and he was competent in Hebrew, which was quite kind of a new thing at that point in the late Middle Ages. He wrote sermons, he wrote Bible commentaries, disputations for doctoral students. That's what was sort of an exam that was used for doctoral students in those days. Theological treatises on a number of themes. He wrote often very contextually about issues that were arising, ethical issues and reflections. David Firmer is going to talk a little bit more about his ethics in a few weeks. We have copies of letters he wrote, which are quite interesting. If any of you, I know some of you in here are Lutherans, the Lutherans in the crowd will be familiar with Luther's Small Catechism, a document written for the popular a popular document written for lay people. Many of you will have sung or have heard Ein feste Burg, that was his text, and he also wrote a number of hymn tunes. Luther writes for the reader. If you ever want to read a theologian who's not dull, I would recommend Luther. He writes in a very pointed way. He writes for the person on the street. It's not difficult to read most of his writings. He's sometimes kind of rude and sometimes kind of crude. He writes with a lot of irony, and he uses a good deal of scatological language. And he's quite an interesting guy. He's brilliant, a great rhetorician, and he writes, but above all, he writes with a sense that he's writing in the presence of God. For Luther, the presence of God, it really is at the heart of his work. So the first topic we want to talk about is justification. So not so long ago, like a couple weeks ago, I was reading a note somewhere in a footnote, and there was a reference to when Luther invented the doctrine of justification by faith. So no, Luther did not invent the doctrine of justification by faith. So this is from Romans 5:1. Some of us will know that. Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So the doctrine of justification by faith is not an invented doctrine, but it's there in the Bible. What it means has been a question that continues for people across the Christian faith and perhaps other faiths as well. But what I want to do now is think a little bit about how they thought about justification before Martin Luther. This is Botticelli's Inferno, Canto 18. So it's a kind of an interesting piece. We're just going to take a minute and look at this. Think about what strikes you in the image. What kind of a feeling does it give you? Where do your eyes wander? If you want, you don't have to, but if you want, feel free to turn to your neighbor and say, well, this I find this interesting, or gee, this is weird. So I should tell you that thank you for your conversation. I can hear people are thinking things through. That's great. I feel kind of bad interrupting, but I did come to talk, so I suppose I should do a little bit of that, shouldn't I? So Luther's early conversation partner as he's thinking about justification was a theologian whose name was Gabriel Biel. Gabriel Biel had a particular understanding of how justification works. The word justification really means simply making right, making things right. And so the biblical theme is that there's some brokenness in our relationship with God, and somehow that brokenness needs to be made right. So how is this brokenness made right? So Gabriel Biel believed that humans can, without the aid of grace, love God above all else. Biel had a realistic anthropology. He knew that people are broken, but he also knew that they could have a good heart and they could do the best that they wanted. And so he believed that God, to be righteous, would have to take what they offered as what's best, and so if they could do their best on their way to God, God would then reach in and pull them further into the reign of God. So if there's a line called sin and another line called grace, we'll do it this way. If there's sin and grace, and I'm on the sin side, I can maybe only move this far. I can never get all the way to grace, but if I do the best I can do, Gabriel Biel said, that's enough for God. God just wants us to do the best we can do. There's a Latin phrase, facere quod in se est. Do what is in you. If you can do what is in you, you make an honest effort, then God is going to say, that's enough. Doing your best suffices so that grace will come and meet you. This is the theological it's a shortened version of the theological landscape. So justification was really about the human doing the best they could do and then God meeting them halfway. So this slide is from the image is from Caravaggio's The Conversion of St. Paul. I'm naming it Changing the Subject, and I'll tell you why in a bit. Caravaggio is just beautiful. His paintings are so lovely. I really enjoy them. And the conversion of St. Paul is a great topic, a great image to be using for this part of the conversation, because subject in this sense, I want to think about what's the subject of sentences. And so as Luther in his early career started thinking about Biel, he was mindful that the human doing their best is really all about the human really saving themselves. At the end of the day, the human was the one responsible for their own salvation and was deemed by Biel competent to do what needed to be done. So when Luther thought and talked about being a human, he said there's sort of two modalities of being human that are critical to understand if we want to talk about justification, about being made right with God. The one modality is the human as an agent. That's a doer. An agent, this is where we get the word agency. It comes from the Greek ago, I do, I act. The other modality of being a human was to be a patient. That's something happens to you. It comes from the Greek word pasco, or I suffer. Something is coming to me. Something's being done to me. So if we imagine, for instance, I go to a massage therapist and I get a massage. The massage therapist is the agent working on my back, and I'm the patient, laying there passively receiving what's being given to me. So as Luther thinks about the theme of justification by grace through faith, his concern is that Beale makes the human the agent in being made right. We do something. We're the subject of the sentence. I do what I can do best, and because of that, God rewards me. And Luther wanted to shift the subject. He wanted the subject of the verb to be God, so that God is the one who does the doing, and the human is the agent. As he looked at St. Paul's writing, especially if you look at Romans 5, the image Paul has is the human is in a position of enmity to God, dead to God, and God reaches in and pulls them into the reign of God. And so the theme of justification by grace makes God the subject of the sentence. Justification is about what God does, not about what I do. I receive God's grace, and that's the thing about grace. Grace is something that we receive, not something that we do. There's a way of thinking about it, and grace is variously understood, and in the Middle Ages, grace was almost talked about as if it was a thing. It was a thing that God offers us. And sometimes in contemporary language, too, grace is discussed as if it's a thing. But Luther, I think in continuity with St. Augustine and Paul, didn't understand grace as a thing so much as grace is God's way of acting. Grace names what God does. Faith names our reception of it. So when we talk about being justified by grace, that means God is the agent who draws us into the reign of God. God doesn't offer us grace, but grace is about God intervening. There's a very active picture of God in this. God is the one who reaches into our lives despite our refusal, despite our weakness, despite our whatever, and grabs a hold of us in love and pulls us close to God's heart, where we feel the presence of the divine. And faith is what happens as a result of that. Faith shows up. Faith arrives, is born in us when God shows up. When God arrives, faith is born. So these are important pieces of the puzzle as we think about what justification is. So this was Luther's theme that was started the Reformation in a way. And here's our next slide. So the Latin phrase at the top, reformata semper reformanda, was a kind of a watchword of the Reformation. And it means reformed, but always being reformed. Reformed, but always being reformed. And the idea for the reformers was the work they had to do in terms of re-understanding what justification was in their context was something that wasn't ever to be done, finished with. This task of reviewing and revising and renewing was a perennial task, and the church always needs to be looking at its context and trying to understand anew how to interpret some of these themes in its context. And that continues to be a case with the theme of justification. It's interesting that I remember reading about a study done some years ago about among Lutherans in the United States of America, asking them how did they know, how could they come to be right with God, or how did they experience, what did they have to do, how did they come to know God's love? And the vast majority of them said, God loves me if I do good things. So all of a sudden, the subject went back to if I do good things. And so it shows us that this message of justification, of God's unconditional love, despite our incapacity to do well, is easily lost. Justification sometimes for Lutherans becomes an idea, sort of an intellectual concept that we need to check off. And if we can check off that we've got that figured out, then we feel like we're in a good place with God, forgetting that justification isn't an idea. Justification is an event. It's God intervening in our lives to change who we are, to change our situation so we have a new and fresh way to understand the world in which we live. I should mention, I don't mean to, and I'm not, I don't mean to dismiss Roman Catholicism on this front at all. There's always a fair question of, did Luther react against what Roman Catholics really taught and thought, or was he reacting against how he understood that? That's an open question. And if you read Roman Catholics, there are Roman Catholics who would, or Catholics before they were Roman Catholics, within the Western tradition, who would be very much on board with Luther's definition and understanding of grace. So it's not so much a Lutheran versus Catholics, it's how do people in the church around the world understand it, and how do you interpret it for your context? I'm very happy to say, I mean, many of you probably know this, that in 1999, the Lutherans and Roman Catholics have issued a declaration on the joint understanding of justification. I'm sort of saying that basically many of those condemnations that we gave one another in the 16th century really don't apply. We've come to have the same understanding of justification with some subtle differences. There are differences, but really we're close enough that we can really understand it. So we need to always be reformed and ever being reformed. This is a picture of Christer Stendahl. The reason I put up a picture of Christer Stendahl is he wrote a book, the name just escaped me. But at the heart of the book was the image that Luther's understanding of justification in Paul missed some important pieces of Paul. That the whole language of justification for St. Paul in the book of Romans was centered around the question of how do Jews and Christians relate with one another. This is a big piece of Paul's letter in Romans chapters 8 through 11. And Luther sort of used this whole argument that Paul, it's a very sophisticated argument that Paul makes to sort of show how there's room for Christianity within the world of Judaism, and there's a place for the Jewish world in God's design. Luther doesn't, somebody else, Daniel Mose is going to tackle the Jewish question. It's a big issue later on. But Luther doesn't address that when he looks at Romans. He thinks mostly about what is God saying to me as an individual, because as you can see, the whole theme of the medieval world was one in which I'm worried about what my relationship with God. I'm very anxious about this. And Luther wanted to placate what Christer Stendahl called the introspective conscience of the West. So we're very worried about who I am. And Luther scholars now, Pauline scholars often will say Luther didn't get Paul right. Well, that's open for debate. And I don't think it's too big of a deal. Luther was speaking to his context, but now we need to speak to our context. And so we might ask ourselves, what does this message of justification say to us today? How is it relevant for us today? I'm guessing, and I could be wrong, but I'm guessing that most of you don't go home and say, am I going to go to hell when I die? And probably you're not super anxious about, does God hate me? Or am I doing the right things for God? And certainly your kids are probably not asking those questions. And your grandkids most certainly are not asking those questions. So what does justification say to us today when those are not the predominant questions in the West? Well, then we might ask, what are the questions that are being asked in the West? It's interesting, at coffee this morning, we were talking about this, and we're talking about the anxiety that we see in a lot of our students. And students talk a lot about being anxious, and we have a strong sense that they're really anxious. And we'll get these notes from the learning center or from the mental health center about so-and-so has an anxiety issue. My kids talk about their friends that have anxiety issues. And we're talking about that, and we're thinking about, well, what is the anxiety? We talk quite a lot about the climate issue, right? I have a friend whose daughter is about the same age as my daughter's, and she's trying to decide what she was going to do with her career. And he said part of the problem for her is she can't imagine herself 20 to 30 years from now because she's not sure the planet will be habitable. So can you imagine if that's your vision of the future, that you don't even know if the world is going to be habitable? So that brings on a kind of anxiety. And that question, as you know, if you open the newspaper or watch television, comes to us again and again and again. People aren't worried whether God loves them so much. They're worried whether the world will be whether they'll be able to live in the world. So this is a different kind of concern and worry that's shaping people. So we might ask, how can justification speak to that? And again, I think the thing we want to ask is how can we change the subject? How can we bring God into the conversation? Not in the sense that God is going to take care of everything. God has given us tools and capabilities and the power to make changes, to work at a political level for a better environment, for a better world, and we're invited to do that. But God also gives the Spirit to us to give us encouragement and comfort in the power of community as we work together. So there's big questions that face people today. Justification still can be something that can speak to us by changing the subject, by inviting us to imagine, how is the divine at work in this? Let's move on and talk a little bit about Luther's theology of the cross. Again, Luther didn't invent this, but he drew heavily upon St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Famous passage from from 1 Corinthians. So this message of the cross, after the death of Jesus, the cross becomes a kind of an image or a symbol that's very powerful. This is the Eisenheim altar by Matthias Gruenwald. I'll invite you again to take a minute to take a look if you want to chat with your neighbor about this. This is such a rich picture, it deserves a little bit of time. Okay. So I want to talk just a little bit about spirituality in the medieval church. Charles Taylor, who wrote A Secular Age, talks a lot about what the religious world was in the Western Middle Ages and the Reformation, how it reshaped it, and how it has some products, some effect in the modern world. And as he talked about that, he talked about a two-tier Christianity in the medieval ages. Clerics were typically learned people in society. There weren't so many people who would have the capacity or the facility to write and read Latin. But it wasn't the clerics alone who were religious. Lay people also were devout, very devout, had a strong belief in God. Taylor describes it as the spirituality of the clergy was savoir, and the spirituality of the lay people was faire. So thinking or knowing versus doing. Two different approaches in terms of spirituality. He also talks about how there's certain movements within the Church Catholic in the West to increase, and they want to see people take their devotion more seriously. So this is sort of the time period in which mandatory once-a-year communion was induced, so people were supposed to take communion. But he also talks, interestingly enough, about lay people, sort of the pious folk. One of their greatest fear is, he describes it as the fear of the dead. And so their worldview is a bit of we would call it a superstitious worldview, and so they turn to the church for things like blessing items. They go on pilgrimages. They have rituals and devotions that are very embodied because they felt, because they weren't able to read, their religious life wasn't so much a life of the mind as a life of the whole body, and so this was an important part of them. They had a hunger for God, but the message they were receiving was that they needed to be more holy, and as a result of that, they had an increasing fear of, am I holy enough? So it's, am I holy enough so that when I die, I'll be in the place I need to be? And so there's a kind of a shift in spirituality that Taylor describes. Increasingly, there's a sense of solidarity with the Christ of the cross because people who were struggling to make their way through life, worrying that they weren't holy enough, would see an image like this, and they would identify with a Jesus who's gaunt and broken. This is also a time when there's a growth of mysticism, and with this growth of mysticism, you have people talking about having a direct access to God by virtue of their mystical experiences. But the problem is that most people don't have mystical experiences where they encounter the divine. And so then the question becomes, what about me? What do I do? What do I do? Since I'm not holy enough, I'm not a brother, I'm not a priest, I'm not a nun, but I know I need to be right with God, and so how do I make myself right with God? Maybe they weren't so convinced by people like Gabriel Biel. But sort of, we know that one of you learned a little bit last week about the theme of indulgences, and so this sets it up for the possibility of indulgences to have this power to placate people's sense of lack before God. So even though I can't be holy enough, by purchasing an indulgence, I can move myself closer towards the line. So this was kind of the world, is the spiritual world in which Luther lived. He responded to that with the 95 Theses. So you've heard a little bit about the 95 Theses last week, talking about how the problem with indulgences and God's love is unconditional, and there's not this need to sort of pay for salvation. In fact, it's impossible to pay for salvation. Luther changes the subject, sort of sets the world afire a little bit in his corner of the world anyways. I can't pretend it made a big difference. People in Rome would hear murmurings about something in Germany, but it wasn't at the forefront of everybody's agenda. What are we going to do about those Germans at that point anyways? But it was making a bit of a rumble in Luther's world, and so his supervisor, Luther was an Augustine monk, Staupitz, asks him to prepare theses, a set of things to discuss with fellow monks so that they could get clear about what is it you're talking about. Luther, of course, understood himself to be utterly faithful within the Catholic tradition because he was drawing very heavily upon St. Augustine as he's sort of bringing back this theme of justification. God's unconditional love for us. And so Staupitz asks Luther to write a document in which he discusses the topics of sin, the topics of the free will, and the topic of grace. And Luther pens in 1518 a book called the Heidelberg Disputation. And in the Heidelberg Disputation, Luther starts by following Staupitz's advice. And he first begins by saying, well, let's talk about good works. So Staupitz asked about sin. Luther talked a little bit about good works, quite a bit about good works in getting ready for this. And he says, most of us sort of understand our way to respond to sin is by doing good things. And so we do good things and thinking that we can sort of make ourselves right with God. But as we look at the Bible, we discover all too often that the things we think are good actually aren't so very good. I suppose today we might say, as we look at our good deeds, we discover they're often tainted by mixed motives. And so those mixed motives, sometimes when people are doing really nice things, there's a kind of something rather self-centered in it. And Luther just sort of says, let's look at our good works, and we discover that, maybe when I thought I was doing something good, I wasn't doing something so good. So maybe the good works that I do aren't so good. And also, the other thing that Luther said in that is when we read the Bible, some of the things that God does, we think this is incredibly unbelievable. But because God's doing them, they actually are the right things. God's doing the right thing. Well, then let's talk about the will, the free will. So Luther does an exploration of the will and talks about how Paul says in Romans 7, the thing I want to do, I can't do. So Paul especially sort of frames the incapacity of the will to will well. And Luther again says, so we have this belief that we can choose the right thing, but when we look at ourselves carefully, we discover that more often than not, we choose poorly. So maybe our will isn't so free after all. So that's what he does with sin and the free will, basically saying we think we do good works, but maybe they're not so good. We think we have free will, but maybe it's not so free. And then he does an excursus. He walks away from Staupitz of Weiss, and he talks about a theologian of glory and a theologian of the cross. He contrasts these two ways of doing theology. And he says, a theologian of glory calls good bad and bad good. He sort of has in mind, as you think about this, the language of a theologian of glory. In the medieval context, people are going to think about glory. Oh, that's like the pomp and splendor of the church. That's going to come to mind, their experience of the church. A theologian of the cross, they're going to be thinking about this image a little bit more rather than the pomp and splendor. So a theologian of glory is contrasted with a theologian of the cross. A theologian of the cross calls a thing what it is, speaks the truth. But this is kind of interesting in the context of the Heidelberg Disputation, because as Luther's readers were going along, they realized that those good works that I call good actually aren't good. So that means that I'm a theologian of glory. Luther sort of trapped the reader. So the readers found out to be self-discovered that they're somebody who calls what's bad good and what's good bad, and they have this sense of anxiety, this sense that I failed. And at that point, Luther, in a kind of a swift rhetoric, shows or invites us to know that God, when we come to this point of honesty and we actually declare to ourselves and to God that I'm not who I claim to be, that's an opening for us, and God draws us into the life of God and makes of us a theologian of the cross. So this sort of movement that Luther does is a movement in which he takes theologians of glory and turns them into theologians of the cross, so that we become a theologian of the cross. This is a moment of self-discovery that God, remember, God as a subject, has done for us. So a theology of the cross. And then he goes on to talk about what happens when you see the world from the perspective of a theologian of the cross. And this is where I think Luther gets very interesting. He talks about how, first of all, we despair of doing good works, and we just follow God without worrying about whether our works are good. We just do the things that God calls us to do. But also very importantly in the theology of the cross is Luther tells us that God is to be found in places where you least expect to find God. God is to be found in places where you least expect to find God. If you go to places of suffering, there is God. If you go to places of loneliness, there is God. If you go to places of feelings of lack of self-worth, God is there. God meets us in our brokenness. God is present in our suffering. This is at the core of a theology of the cross. We'll just take a quick look here at the Paul Gauguin image. What is the name of that image? I just lost my sheet. The Yellow Christ. So it's interesting, the Yellow Christ, we have, I'm pretty sure this is not Golgotha, right? I'm guessing it's probably France. So the theme is Jesus is in France. He's on the cross in the midst of people's daily lives. So if we sometimes live in a world where we imagine God is to be found in temples and places of splendor, but the theology of the cross has Jesus right in the midst of your daily life. Where you don't necessarily think you're going to find God, that's where God is. But our Reformata Semper Reformanda is still there, and so the question then becomes, what are some ways in which a theology of the cross has been misused, and how can we reclaim and rethink about a theology of the cross in a present context? So one of the ways in which a theology of the cross can be misused is it becomes a kind of maybe a kind of a diagnostic tool. So we have this intellectual idea that God is present in suffering, so now I have the key to finding God. God is present in suffering, so now I have the key to finding God. But you'll notice that phraseology I'm using, I've become the subject of the sentence again, and it also sort of presumes that God is lost, right? And that's decidedly not what a theology of the cross is about, that instead God comes to us when we least expect God. So we live a life of openness to God, knowing that God will show up where we need God the most. So when I think about what does a theology of the cross say for us today, I think for me, one of the pieces that comes to mind is the idea that a lot of us don't know what to do with the doubt we experience. When we see suffering, when we see trials and troubles in the world, we have doubts in our faith. And sometimes we feel bad about doubting. We feel as if doubting is our failure on our part. And I don't think it matters what your faith tradition is, if you're Lutheran, Roman Catholic, or Muslim, or whatever. I think all of us have doubts, and we're not so sure what to do about doubts. And one of the themes that a theology of the cross invites us to imagine is that doubts are a part of faith. Doubts are not the opposite of faith. The opposite of faith is certainty, but that doubt and faith are the same side, two sides of the same coin. And so a theology of the cross invites us to enter into the suffering, the difficulties of life with our doubts. And the beauty of being able to enter into the suffering and the reality of life with our doubts is we can do it honestly. We can do it honestly. Too often in the church, we give people the message or the impression that everything has to be shiny and roses and perfect. But this isn't life. And a theology of the cross recognizes that this is not life. And instead of worrying about looking good, we should be thinking about being true to ourselves, being true to our experiences. This is what a theology of the cross invites us to do. The image is Victor Brauner's Coup de Doute. He was a surrealist Romanian, so the success of doubt, or the movement of doubt. So we'll move on to talk about vocation and the priesthood of all believers. So here from Philippians 3:14, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the heavenly call of God in Christ Jesus, from Philippians 3:14. The word call there is important for me. Here again we have another contemporary image, Georgia O'Keeffe. So we often know Georgia O'Keeffe as the person who paints the flowers. They're beautiful flowers. This isn't a flower, obviously, a little earlier in her career, but she has some beautiful images of buildings and such. Take a moment again. We'll take another minute to just reflect on this painting. And again, if you want to chat with your neighbor, go for it. So I'm going to read for you a short description from the American Art website about this painting. It says, it illustrates O'Keeffe's tendency to overlay objective fact with spiritual and symbolic meanings. At the end of the building's gable roof, the triangular shape of the structure is emphasized, a compositional choice that O'Keeffe may have derived from theories of Wassily Kandinsky, who believed that the triangle was a symbol of the soul. So I don't know if that's what she had in mind, but it's kind of interesting to think about, isn't it? The soul is there right in the midst of this rather utilitarian-looking building. It was her. The title is My Shanty, Lake George. So this is where she stayed for some months while she was doing some painting in the midst of her work as an art student. So we're talking a little bit about vocation. Vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, to call. In the medieval church, vocation was only used with respect to clergy and the religious. So if you had a call, that meant that you were called to be a priest or perhaps a nun. With Luther, that gets questioned. It's kind of an important piece in the Lutheran world, that the word vocation for Luther first needs to be understood as with respect to Christ. Christ had a vocation, a calling. The incarnation is about the task that was given Christ to draw us into God's love, reign of love. So it first applies to Christ, but then to all Christians and in a sense to all people. So in Luther's understanding, all of reality is under the eye of God. Not just the churchly reality, but all of reality is under the eye of God, under the hands of God, the left and the right hands of God. And everybody has a place in this world. God has assigned and given everyone a place to be. It's interesting, sometimes when I contrast the ancient world with the contemporary world for my students, I'll talk about, for us contemporaries, one of our big questions is, what am I going to do with my life? This is also a source of anxiety for our students. What am I going to do with my life? Well, if you were a miller's son in the 14th century, you didn't have to ask that question because you were going to become a miller. Like it was decided. But it was also valued. Your role as a miller, your role as a peasant, no matter what you did was important because society was a singularity, it was a whole. It all fit together. Everybody had a place. Luther largely inherited and believed this. This was his worldview. And he used a German word to describe what that place was. He called it a Stand. This is sort of where you are. This is your Stand, is where you are. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's honest, right? So if you were a thief, that's not a Stand. You can't be a thief as a Stand. So you had to have an honest position, but any position you had was valued by God and seen to be of equal importance all within the body politic. But then he took another idea and he sort of said, for Christians though, if they understand what they're doing as in some way responding to the love of God in Christ, that somehow this has been faith has been awakened in them, there's a kind of a conversion, not only of who I am as a person, but my Stand itself becomes a Beruf. Beruf has in it the German word rufen, calling. So all of a sudden, it's not only that I have a place in life, but the place God has given me in life, which is exceedingly good, becomes even better because that place now becomes a way by which I can praise and love God. It becomes a tool, a means by which I can live my Christian life and be faithful to God and give God praise and serve the world with a new and warm heart. So this is such an important piece of Luther's understanding of what it is to have a vocation. So, reformata semper reformanda. So this is the Ghent altarpiece. I don't know, did any of you listen to the CBC last night around, I don't know, I was going home after chapel around 7 and I had my radio on. I think it was the Currents. Somebody started talking about the Ghent altarpiece. No hands are raised. So the Ghent altarpiece, there's apparently somewhere in here a sheep. The sheep is kind of important. Lambs, of course, are important as religious symbolism within medieval and ancient religious iconography. But apparently the Ghent altarpiece, the art historians are doing some cleaning, they're cleaning it up. And there's this, as they're cleaning it up, they discovered that the sheep had been painted over. The eyes had been painted over. And as they cleaned up the sheep, all of a sudden they discover that the sheep had human eyes. So not animal eyes, but human eyes. Because the painter, Jan van Eyck, wanted the lamb to be connected with the lamb, I'm guessing. And so, but somebody in the 16th century said it's a little bit weird, so he painted it over. So at any point, one of the things from this is this image of, we all have a place. This is a very kind of medieval picture of the world. See, everybody has a place, right? There's people at the top, there's people at the bottom, there's God at the top, but there's a place that's all very well ordered. And so Luther's notion of vocation includes this, which is in some ways marvelous. There's some things I just absolutely love about Luther's notion of vocation, that everybody has a place and it's valued and you can serve and love God. You don't have to become a pastor, you don't have to become a bishop, you don't have to become a cardinal to serve God. Though he has this beautiful phrase where he talks about the mother who's changing the diaper of her child is doing a work that's as important for God as the priest is who is blessing the bread and wine for communion. It's just remarkable. It's marvelous. It sets people free, that what you do matters in God's eyes. You don't have to do something special. You don't have to become a missionary. You don't have to become a pastor. You don't have to change the world. That the work you do, whatever it is, matters to God. And it's a way that the reign of God gets pushed out and reached out in the world. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. But there's a problem with Luther's understanding of vocation. And the problem is that Luther was a late medieval thinker locked into a late medieval way of thinking. And that way of thinking was, if you're a miller's daughter or a miller's son, well, if you're a miller's daughter, it's a different story altogether. But if you're a miller's son, you're going to be a miller, right? There's no room for movement. So this is a problem for Luther's world, that you have to somehow answer and think through. In our day and age, that sort of notion of being so fixed and so fixed doesn't really work so well for people. There wasn't really you couldn't choose as well. Your choice. This was given to you clearly. So how can we challenge and think more carefully about vocation in a contemporary world? And I'd like us to return again a little bit to the question we had at coffee this morning, thinking about what does it mean for young people today, and for us too, who face some of these crises like climate crises. How do we deal with this reality, this anxiety that we have? What are some answers, and how might Luther's notion of vocation give us some role to play, or some hope for the future? And as we talked this morning, we started to talk a little bit about the role of the communities. We talked about the community that we have with one another in the church. We talked about the community we have within the places in which we live and move and work, our city here. We talked about nations and the global world. But then we also talked about something that I'm learning from my indigenous friends about the other community in which we live is all of reality, all of creation. We're part of a community that includes the trees. They're part of a community that includes the dolphins. We're part of a community that includes the mosquitoes. All of us are related. So the indigenous folk in this part of Turtle Island talk about all my relations, recognizing that I fit inside this community that's so much bigger than I ever imagined. But the important thing about this is, not only do I fit in a community that's bigger than I ever imagined, I'm also a part of a story that's way bigger than I ever imagined. Most of us have stories. Stories are so important for us. But most of us, too many of us, I'm not going to say most of us, too many of us have too small stories, because our story is about me. There's not an us story. So I think the first step for us is, as people, to have an us story, to find a community where you fit, so that you're a part of this together. You're not by yourself. You're not trying to fix the climate crisis. You're not trying to bring social justice by yourself. You're a part of a community that has a bigger story. For Christians, we fit in. We have this sort of meta-narrative, this big story that's told to us in the Bible, told for us in the Bible. But I think as human beings, as a human race, we're also part of the Earth story. And the Earth story is this huge story. The place we're living is billions of years old. We're just a tiny speck in this large narrative. And I think we can find some meaning and perhaps some solace in recognizing that no matter what happens, that story is not done. And we're a part of that story. That story is always going to be a part of who we are. And so as we think about what it means to be a part of that story, we're invited to be involved in that. How am I doing for time? Just got a couple minutes. So a part of Luther's theology of creation is something called the priesthood of all believers. So the priesthood of all believers comes with the idea that not only are we called to be, that not only are priests, let me rephrase that. Luther's notion of the priesthood of all believers is framed by the idea that the first priest is Christ, and we're members of Christ's priesthood by virtue of our baptism. We're drawn into God's life, and by virtue of that, we are priests as well. This is countered. Luther's understanding of the priesthood of all believers is opposite from what might be the priesthood of some believers, so that there's certain people who are priests, or the priesthood of each believer. That's everybody is a priest on their own. The priesthood of all believers presumes that we're working together. We're working together in response to what Jesus calls us to do, and as we work together, we do it as a community. So I think one of the, Luther sometimes calls this the common priesthood too. So I think as we think about our tasks as priests, we're all priests. We all have the job. We're all called together into the priesthood of Christ. As we think about the common priesthood, and as we think about climate challenges, I think the other thing we might want to imagine is that we're part of a cosmic priesthood. We're part of a cosmic priesthood. Too often, we think about the world as a stage on which a divine drama is being played. But I think we're called to imagine that this world is actually one of the players in the play, and perhaps a more important player than we are. Most certainly a more important player than we are. So this image you have in the Bible, if you read the Psalms, of the mountains praising God, of the trees singing to God, this image, we sometimes think about it as if it's just pretty pictures, but I think if we take seriously what creation seems to be telling us is, this is real. The trees and the animals, they're part of this story too, and we're invited to be a part of this story. We're called into this story, and we're called to be part of the healing of the whole of the cosmos, and to be partners with the cosmos itself. One of the things we learn about working with marginalized groups is, or people who are oppressed, is if their voice isn't heard, if they're not the ones leading the healing, then it's not healing, it's not helpful. We need to think about that in terms of the climate too. What is the earth telling us? Not just what do we think we need to do to the earth, but what is the earth? Are we ready to stop and listen to our partner in this cosmic priesthood we're called to be a part of?
You are listening to Everything New is Old Again, Tradition and Innovation in Luther's Theology and Religious Practice, a lecture by Reverend Dr. Alan Jorgenson, Professor of Systematic Theology and Assistant Dean of Martin Luther University College. At this point, Dr. Jorgenson gives the audience a short break. When the talk resumes, he shares the story of a tragedy that happened early in his work as a pastor.
The kind of cry that pierces your soul and that just makes you want to weep. This woman's child, her little daughter, had been riding with her father on an ATV. This is in northern Alberta. People have these vehicles they drive around. I don't know if you know what ATV is. And he had hit a rock, and the little girl bounced off the back. She didn't have a helmet, and she was killed instantly. And so I arrived at the hospital at the time that this was happening. So I did my business that I was doing that day. The ambulance and everybody was doing what they were doing. And I went home to my office and continued my work as I was doing. And later that day, I got a knock on the door, and answered the door, and lo and behold, there was Father Joly from the local Roman Catholic Church. He was an oblate, a lot of oblates in northern Alberta, and he came. We had really good relations. We chatted with one another quite a bit. He was a big fan of Vatican II. In fact, he gave me a copy of Vatican II. He was so proud of Vatican II. Great guy. He was just lovely and warm. Anyways, he knocked on my door. He said, "Alan, I need your help. I need your help. This little girl that has died, they're a part of his parish. They were a part of his parish, and he just couldn't do this by himself. I just can't do it by myself, Alan. He said, so I said, of course, Father Jolie, I'll gladly help you. I'll gladly help you. And so I did. I helped him, and together we did this funeral. It was such a tragic death. It was too much for him to do by himself. And so we worked together and did this funeral. And I thought afterwards, that could not have happened 20, 30 years earlier. It wouldn't have happened. Something had changed. The Lutheran and the Roman Catholic Church were starting to do work together. There was conversations. There had been Vatican II. The Lutheran World Federation was doing work on the Doctrine of Justification. And there was a bit of a convergence, enough of a convergence that a local Roman Catholic priest could come and visit a Lutheran pastor and ask for help. And so I think part of what I want to think about when we think about the legacy of Martin Luther, to recognize that it's a kind of it's not all good. So in 2017, on the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Reformation, the Lutheran World Federation was very careful to call it a commemoration, not a celebration. Because although Luther had a lot of good things to say, and I'm a big Luther fan, also we have to recognize the deep division and structures that have been a part of, that have come after the Reformation, and that just simply has to be acknowledged, but it also needs to be lamented. And it also needs to be questioned. We need to be working for a new way of being together as church in the world. So I'm going to see where I'm at here. Yeah, what is this? I'm sort of lost, but we'll get there eventually. So this is Judy Chicago's Rainbow Shabbat. So Judy Chicago's Rainbow Shabbat. Yeah, it's a lovely piece. So what I want us to do for the next little while, I've got some questions I need to respond to, but I also want to spend some time talking about Luther's word and sacrament. And instead of starting with scripture for this section, I'm going to let Martin say a few things himself so we can hear a little bit of Luther's voice here. So writing from Luther's Works, volume 23, he says, "Furthermore, Christ himself is present when I preach, for Christ is present and makes my words come true." Luther had a very, very confident understanding of the role of the spoken word in the life of the church. Sometimes Luther is described as being attentive to something called the living word. The living word is the Bible isn't a document with ideas. The Bible is a document where we encounter a person. And the person we encounter for Luther is the Word himself. Jesus encounters us in the Scriptures. Sometimes Luther called the Bible or likened the Bible to a cradle that holds the Christ. The Christ is in the cradle, and as we go to this cradle, as we go to this word, we encounter Jesus there. So sometimes Luther is credited with talking about something called sola scriptura, Scripture alone. Interestingly, Luther also talks about grace alone and faith alone, Christ alone, and cross alone in some places too. So you kind of wonder, how can you have five alones? It's a good question. But he does have these five alones, but they all have the same function. They're pointing us to what God does for us in Christ, how God has this plan of mending the universe, and through Jesus is drawing us into the love of God so that we can be a part of God's vision of mending the universe. And so Luther, when he would be reading Scripture, he'd be asking himself, "Was treibt Christum?" What's making me see Jesus more clearly in this text? That was sort of a tool he had, for an interpretive tool for making sense of what a text said. There was another very important interpretive tool that Luther had for making sense of a text. It's the dialectic of law and gospel. So it's interesting. Just this last Monday, we had an event at our school on the legacy of Luther vis-a-vis the Jews. And so again, somebody's going to talk to you a little bit about that in a few weeks, Daniel Maus. our Jewish scholar in residence at our school. But I will say this much, that one of the contentious points between Judaism and Lutheranism is, what does the law mean and what does the law do? Jewish people have a rather different understanding of that word than we do, and I would say that Luther has a very technical, specific definition of the word law. The word law means is a way to describe what God expects of us. It's that simple. Law is simply, what does God expect us to do? Gospel is, what does God promise us and promise to do for us? And as you look at the Bible, Luther would say all of the Bible is composed of law and gospel. Either what God is asking us to do or what God is promising to do for us or to us. This is all of Scripture. The other thing that would be important as you think about Luther's understanding of Scripture as law and gospel is, it's not the case that the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures are law and the New Testament is gospel, but there's gospel and law all the way through both. Luther was very convinced that the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Hebrew Scriptures of the Old Testament were faithful to the Messiah who was to come. In fact, he says, he would call them Christians. He would say, these people in the Old Testament are better Christians than we are because we've had Jesus and they were anticipating Jesus, and still they were faithful in the midst of that. So this law and gospel is an important part of Luther's understanding of texts. The other thing I'd want to say about Luther and this theme of the word is, I was going to change a slide. Sorry, I'll do that right now. This is Hey Ki, the risen Lord. The other thing that's important about Luther and his understanding of the text and of the preaching life of the community is, Luther famously described the church as a Munt house. The word Munt house means a house of speaking, so the house of the mouth. This is actually quite interesting because if you look at medieval Christianity, the sense that's given priority in medieval Christianity is the eyes. In fact, when medieval Christians would talk about going to heaven, they would call it attaining the beatific vision, the beautiful vision, the blessed vision, because it was the eyes that were so important. And it's not altogether too surprising that the eyes were so important, especially for lay folk, because they would go to church and the Mass would be in Latin, and if there was a sermon, it would be in Latin, and they didn't necessarily understand Latin, or probably didn't. And so what they saw was for them the sermon. So they would look to the stained glass. They would look to paintings. They would look to iconography. They would look to statues, and that's where they would receive the message of the Bible. But Luther was quite insistent that what happens in church needs to be in the language of the people, and so one of his principal tasks was, in addition to translating the Bible into German, was preaching in German and slowly making the liturgy a German liturgy. And so as he continues to think about, and as he continued to work through that, the importance of the spoken word became accentuated. And it wasn't only about the importance of the spoken word, but even beyond that was that thinking about what an ear is and does versus an eye. So one of the interesting things that you know from your personal experience is, if you don't like what you're seeing, you can close your eyes or turn your head. It's not so easy to close your ears, is it? Yeah, it's kind of hard to close your ears. And you can turn your head if you don't like what you hear, but you're still going to hear it. So ears, there's something about ears that are more passive than active. So remember, I started by talking about the agent and the patient. There's a way in which the hearing is profoundly passive and receptive. That's less true of the eyes. And so the whole theme of the Reformation becomes a part of the hearing. Of course, this theme was taken even further by people who followed Luther in the Reformed tradition. Typically what happened was anything that was visually distracting in a church was taken down and removed. Lutherans also thought about that, by and large decided not to do that. So Lutheran churches will still have stained glass and paintings. We typically don't have statues. So it's a kind of, I would say for Luther, it's the eyes are still pretty important, but the ears have a kind of a primacy that's not true for others. So speaking of eyes and ears, here's a painting. So let's again take a minute to enjoy this painting from this Asian artist and see what you can see in the risen Lord. So we have a cruciform Jesus, so a cross is there, and then there's also a chalice and paten at the bottom, so reminding us of the Lord's Last Supper. And we have disciples around and the women who also were such an important supporter of the ministry of Jesus. Another quote from Luther, "The Spirit cannot be with us except in material and physical things such as the Word, water, and Christ's body, and in his saints on earth." So one of the themes that's quite important for Luther is the materiality of Christ's presence. In this way, he's very much inherits and works within the medieval tradition, and understands the importance of the material piece here. In a way, he's drawing also very heavily on St. Augustine, who has a philosophy or theology of signs, where he talks about sacraments as signs that point to something beyond them. So when we think about the sacraments, they point beyond what they are. They're pointing to, in the sacrament of baptism, to the Spirit that comes to us, and in the sacrament of the Eucharist, to the Christ who is present with us in it. So that's a big piece. The other thing that he gets from St. Augustine is the description or the definition of sacraments as visible word. So this idea that we hear the gospel, but we want more than just to hear the gospel. We want to smell the gospel, we want to taste the gospel, we want to touch the gospel. We want all of our senses in some fashion to be, we're sensual people, like we have bodies. I know we sometimes try to pretend we don't, but we really are, we are embodied. And this whole body, this whole of who we are, needs to be and wants to be informed by this message of God's unconditional love. And so the Spirit uses material and physical things so that our body also gets touched by this gracious love of God. So Luther talks about justification taking shape in the sacraments. So justification is about how God makes us right. And for Luther, God makes us right using word and sacrament. Word, the words God speaks to us through the words of the pastor, make us right. The meal we eat makes us right. The baptism we receive makes us right. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these, but the belief is that material things are used to make us right with God because we're material creatures. So Luther describes sacraments as a means of grace, and sacraments, again, are about changing the subject. They're about what God does rather than what we do. And so Luther here departs a little bit from some of the reformers who follow him, especially in the Anabaptist tradition, where baptism is understood as what we're doing as a means of testimony to our following of God, which is a fair way to understand baptism. Lutherans just understand it differently, and it's a part of the history. It would be good, if we had more time, to talk a little bit more about the relationship of Luther to Anabaptists and to the Reformed tradition as well, to talk a little bit about how things went well and how things didn't go so well. Some of you will know that some years ago, the Lutheran World Federation made an apology to the Anabaptist communion for mistreatment of Anabaptists during the 16th century. So that was an important step in Lutheran identity, I think, is fessing up for some of the things we've done that were wrong and actually horrid. So here's Marc Chagall, Moses and the Burning Bush. So Marc Chagall, as you may or may not know, was a Jewish artist, Jewish painter from Russia who spent most of his career in France. Does a lot with biblical themes. Let's just take a moment again to talk with our neighbor or to mull over this painting. I put this painting up because this is a good example from the Hebrew Scriptures of how God uses something material to bring us something spiritual to us. So, and the material, the great thing about the story of Moses and the burning bush is the bush is not consumed. So something powerful and transcendent comes to something finite, and it doesn't consume it. And so there's this analogy that the power of God comes to us who are finite and broken, but it doesn't destroy us. We can be like a burning bush. We can be a light that calls people into the love of God, into God's mission to heal the universe. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Luther's Theology of Baptism. So Luther writes here from Luther's Works, volume 24, in baptism all Christians begin to die, and they continue to die until they reach the grave. So that's an interesting phrase. They continue to die until they reach the grave. So something happens at the grave. Death is a big theme for Luther connecting with baptism. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. But this is just a picture of Jesus' baptism done by Herod of Landsberg, I think 12th century, I don't exactly remember that. An abbess, so a nun in charge of a nunnery. And so here she's depicted the baptism of Jesus. It's really a lovely, lovely piece. So baptism, what is baptism about? Baptism, again, is about what God does. At baptism, the agent is understood to be God. The patient is the human. It's a once-for-all event that happens. But for Luther, his understanding of baptism was such that it's a daily event in the life of the Christian. So in baptism, the understanding is that at baptism, the Adam in us, or the Eve in us, the sinner in us is drowned. But Luther sort of says, Adam and Eve are really good swimmers. So they keep coming back up, and we have to push them back down every day. So every day there's a daily return to your baptism. Baptism is a very strong motif in Lutheranism. It was interesting when I worked in that shared ministry I told you about in northern Alberta, and I've sort of had interaction with other religious traditions or other Christian traditions. I was always surprised at how, in comparison, how much Lutherans talk about baptism compared to other denominations. So if you'd go to an Anglican church, the focus would be on communion. Lutherans talk about communion too, but Lutherans are really taken by baptism. About something that God does. And it's a part of your daily existence. It's the idea that somehow God takes makes use of water to do something in our lives. And Luther's quite insistent that we need to understand it's not just the water that makes baptism a powerful thing, but it's the water married with the word. Water and word together is what makes a sacrament a sacrament. And so the word that's so important for Luther is a word of promise. The idea for Luther, at the core of Luther's theology, according to Oswald Bayer, a grand interpreter of Luther, is the idea of the promissio, the promise. God is a promising God, and faith hangs on to God's promises. And so we have this picture of the power of the promise, that God promises to give us newness of life, forgiveness of sin, and the promise of the Spirit to lead us through life. Lutherans, of course, baptize infants in continuity with the church, with the Catholic Church. And for Luther, that's because at the core of what happens in baptism is a meeting of the divine and the human. God is in the modality of grace and giving, and we're in the modality of trust and receiving. And Luther would say, infants really can trust pretty well. In fact, sometimes we need to spend time with little ones to learn how to trust, because in our jaded lives we sometimes forget about trusting, or we lose the capacity to trust. I'll tell you a little story about, so I was working on my doctoral program in Toronto, serving this little church up in Aurelia, and got a phone call that one of the families wanted me to come visit. They were at the Children's Hospital in Toronto, and I went and visited them, and they had just discovered their daughter, who was just born, was just a child, had Lee's encephaly. So I don't know if you know what Lee's encephaly is, but it's the folds in the brain aren't folds, and the children that have this condition, basically the prognosis is not great, that they probably won't live very long, but beyond that is they won't be able to speak. They may or may not recognize people. It's a very difficult life for the child and for the parents. And so I was with these parents, and we sort of got through it. The father said, "Can you please just come in with me? I want to hear the surgeon or the doctor say, not the surgeon, the doctor say what the story is again, so because I'm not sure I'm hearing everything right." So I went in with him, and we talked some more about, yes, this is what's happening, this is what's going to happen, this is the life you're looking at. And they were a remarkable couple. They had twins. So they just rose to the occasion and took that little Emily into their life, and they loved her, and they gave her the best life they could. And I remember the day we baptized her, and I thought, what a message of grace, that God's love is just wrapped around this child who's kind of the best patient you could ever imagine, this child who offers nothing to God but her very existence. And her very existence becomes a message of God's love for the whole congregation. It was just a remarkable and beautiful moment in my time with that community. So when I think about baptism, I sometimes think about little Emily and about how God's unconditional love grasps and grabs all of us and draws us into God's reign of love, and how anybody can be a part of that message, So let's talk a little bit about Holy Communion as well. Luther writes, "Thus in the sacrament we too become united with Christ and are made one body with all the saints." So Luther was thought highly of the sacrament of Holy Communion. Here I have Vincent van Gogh's "Workman sitting on a basket cutting bread." So bread is very important for the theme of communion. So it would be worth talking a little bit about the difference between Lutherans and Roman Catholics on the question of communion, because it's a big deal. I don't want to get too much into the details, but basically the Roman Catholic Church, since the 13th century or so, started to use the theme of transubstantiation to explain what happens, so that Christ's body and so the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, and so Christ is really present at the meal. Luther rejected that way of understanding, but didn't reject the presence of Christ at the meal. So for Luther and for Lutherans, at the Holy Communion, the bread and wine is still there, so they don't become Christ's body and blood like it's understood in the Catholic Church. But there still is bread and wine there. But the living Christ, the resurrected Christ, is also present in, with, and under this bread and wine. So Lutherans continue to understand that in some way, Christ is really present for us in the bread and wine, in the presence of this sacrament that's so important for us. The one thing that Luther was very insistent about in reframing and rethinking about communion was the importance of community. So in the Roman Catholic Church of his, or the Catholic Church of his day, priests would sometimes take communion by themselves. And Luther said, that's not communion. Communion always implies community. There should be some of us together at communion. So for Luther, that theme of being together is a really important piece of the puzzle. That the real gift of communion is drawing a community together, and that we gather around this word and sacrament. The other thing that was a big change for the Lutheran community was the introduction of receiving the wine. So in the Catholic Church of his day, people only received the bread, and so there's this introduction of having both bread and wine. That was a kind of a novelty. That was a reclaiming something that was in the past. Luther, however, was also mindful that some people are going to think this is a bit much, this is problematic, and so he always told his pastors to be sensitive to the concerns. This is one of the things about making changes that Luther negotiated, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, is what do you do with people when they're not ready to change, right? Because we live in communities, right? And it's never the case that everybody's on board with any change. So how do you negotiate the different places that people are at when it's time to make changes? And so Luther, in thinking about community, said, well, I think if somebody really doesn't feel like they can have wine, just let them be for now. And so he invited pastors to be sensitive. Other things he wasn't quite so sensible, but in that one he was, so that's good. The other thing that I would want to say that's so, I think, very important about Luther in terms of the meal, and I was just saying this to somebody the other day, and they said, oh, that's good news to hear, is how do you get ready to receive communion? What do you have to do? When are you ready, or when are you worthy to receive communion? And Luther said, those who feel most unworthy are most worthy to receive the sacrament. And so I think that kind of reframes the whole question of worth, that really the gift of communion isn't about you being right so that you can receive this gift from God, but rather it's about you being honest with yourself, and as you accept who you are and you accept that you have needs, then you should come to the table. Luther was said in the Catechisms that pastors should preach about communion in such a way that the congregation demands it. And so in the Word and Sacrament, this theme of God's grace being made real in something concrete is brought to the fore. When I was a pastor in Mannheim, just outside Kitchener, it was a small church, a lovely church, beautiful people, a great experience. One of the things we did, as many churches do these days, is the children went downstairs for Sunday school during the service. It was a small Sunday school, maybe 12, 15 kids. But they would come upstairs for communion, and I can remember on many occasions, so I would be communing adults, serious adults. Everybody's pious, sort of taking the body and blood of Christ with grim faces. And then the kids would come upstairs, and they would be maybe painting, and they would have frocks with paint all over them and maybe cookies in their hair. And they'd run up to the altar, and they'd have these big smiles on their faces. And I thought, this is what it's about, right? This is what it's about, this gift that they bring to the table, So I think that's what I always keep in mind when I think about communion. Reformata semper reformanda. So that's Lauren Harris's Pick Island, Lake Superior. So I'm soon at the point where I'm supposed to stop talking. In fact, I'm already past it, but I'll just say a few things. But then I have some questions to respond to. So what are some of the challenges that we need to think about for Lutherans? And I think other communities are going to share what I'm going to say to some degree. as we think about word and sacrament, as we think about the worship life of the community. Lutherans across North America have inherited a Western European way of doing worship and thinking about worship, but we're not in Western Europe anymore. So the question is, how can we do worship in a way that's authentic to where we are, so that we use images and symbols that reflect the places where we are? I remember going to a Lutheran World Federation event some years ago, and the person was speaking about culture, culturation, questions of how do you make worship, how do you make Christianity available to people in a cultural idioms that make sense for who they are. And they were visiting a church in India, and the church was built in the Swedish style, and the liturgy was a Swedish liturgy with Swedish hymns with Hindi words. And that's not good. That's not what we want. But we have to ask ourselves, how well have we contextualized the Christian message here in Canada? I mean, in Canada, our worship books still, there's a lot of European hymnody and stuff, and that's not bad. It's a part of our heritage. We want to keep it. We're also largely defined and determined by things that are happening in the U.S. So there's always a challenge for us of how do we bring things home? How do we make Christianity Canadian? Christianity is always universal too, but for it to be authentic at some level, it has to taste local. There has to be something local about it. So this is a sort of a plug for Debbie Liu, who's going to come next week and talk about the Canada Center. So you owe me one. So next week, come and hear a little bit about how she's going to do that.
You have been listening to Everything New is Old Again, Tradition and Innovation in Lutherist Theology and Religious Practice. It was the third talk in an 8-lecture series titled Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This lecture series was presented at Rim Park in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, through January and February 2020 by Martin Luther University College and Third Age Learning KW. Thank you for joining us. If you would like more information about Martin Luther University College and its programs, visit the school's website at luther.wlu.ca. And for more information on Third Age Learning KW and its upcoming lectures, visit the website at tal-kw.ca.